We continue now at the top of Daf Memches Amud Aleph in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 48a. The Mishnah said, Par v'sar shal Yom HaKippurim, the par and the soyer, the bull and the he-goat of Yom Kippur, they are slaughtered in the north of the Azara. And the Gemara says, Michdi, let us see, Tzafon ba'ola ksiv. When it comes to the requirement of the north of the Azara, that's actually written by the Karban Ola. So Nisni Ola Beresha. So why doesn't the Mishnah first teach about Ola? Why is it first teaching about the Par v'sar shal Yom HaKippurim? And the Gemara answers to that, Chatos, when it comes to a Karban Chatos, the Par and the Sar of Yom Kippur are Karban Chatos. Aidi da'asi midrasha, since the Chatos is learned from a drasha, Chavivole, so that's more beloved, and that's why the Tana starts with that. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'nisni chatos hachitzono, so why not teach the outer Karban Chatos? Why are we teaching the Par and Sar shal Yom HaKippurim, which are inner Karban Chatos? And the Gemara says to that, Aidi denichnas damon lifnai ve'lifnim, since by the Par and the Sar shel Yom HaKippurim, the blood is brought lifnai ve'lifnim, it's brought into the Kodesh Kodashim, so Chavivale, it's more beloved to the Tana, and that's why the Mishnah starts with that. And the Gemara continues with Tzvona ba'ola hecha ksiva, where do we find north written by Karban Ola? The Gemara says it's from the pasuk v'shachat oso al yerech hamizbeach tzafon. It says that he slaughters it on the northern side of the mizbeach. The Gemara says Eshkechon ben son, so we find that by sheep. That's the context of that pasuk. But ben bakar menolan, from where would we know? Let's say by Karban Ola, that's a ben bakar, that's cattle. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says V'im min hatzon. It uses the vav, a conjunction, V'im min hatzon, vav mosef al inyan rishon. The vav is adding on what we were first talking about, and therefore V'yilmud elyon mitachton. We can learn from what's being discussed above from what's being discussed below, meaning we're talking here about son, and above, earlier we're talking about bakar, and the vav says you can learn the bakar from the tzon. The Gemara says, Hanichal Aman Damar Malamdin, that works according to the one who says that you're able to learn, again, Elyon Mitachdon, Elul Aman Damar Ein Malamdin, Ma'ikol Amemar, but according to the one who says, Ein Malamdin, you can't learn Elyon Mitachdon, what are we going to say? And Rashi explains, Ba'ola Ksiv, it's written by Ola, Gabe Olas Tzon B'Vayikra, this is talking about the Karban Ola, again, of Tzon, of sheep in Vayikra, V'shachat Osa Al Yerech HaMizbeach Tzafon, the pasuk that the Gemara quotes, that he's going to slaughter it on the northern side of the Mizbeach. Midrasha, since Chatas is learned from a drasha, that's mehakesha, it's learned from a hekesh, a comparison in the psukim. Because it's written, Ba'mokom asher tishchat ha'ola, in the place that you slaughter the ola, that's where you're going to slaughter the Chatas. There's a comparison over there, and therefore that's chaviva, that's more beloved. And then the Gemara said, Elyon, the earlier parsha, the upper parsha, that's Parshas ben Bakar, L'malami Parshas ben Son. The parsha in the Torah talks about the ola from Bakar, from cattle, is mentioned earlier than Son, than sheep, and so we can learn the Elyon from the Tachton. And the Gemara says, Hanichel Mandamar Lemeidin Elyon Mitachton Al Yedei Vav Hamos. If that works according to the one who says you can learn Elyon from Tachton through that Vav, but again, according to the one who says you cannot do that, what are we going to say? And the Gemara continues, the Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, V'im Nefesh, the Pasuk says V'im Nefesh, this is in the context of Asham Taloi, and Asham Taloi is brought when a person is not sure if he committed an Aveira that normally would require a Karban Chatos. We'll take a look at the full Pasuk. The full Pasuk says, V'im Nefesh Kisecheta, V'yasasa Achas Mikol Mitzvahs Hashem Asher Lo Seasena. A person sins, he commits an Aveira, V'lo Yada, he doesn't know, V'yashem V'nasa Avono, again, talking about an Asham Taloi. And Rashi explains, V'im Nefesh Gabe Asham Taloi Ksiv, this pasuk is written by Asham Taloi, B'Vayikra and Sefer Vayikra. V'im Nefesh Kisechta, that's the pasuk. U'Lamala Heimena, and then earlier, right before this parsha, is the Parshas Me'ilah, is the parsha that discusses Me'ilah, which is the misuse of consecrated property. Vadois, that's talking about a certain case of Me'ilah. Sheyada la'achar zman, that he finds out, he knows after some time, Shenena mina hektish b'shogeg, that he got benefit from hektish, from consecrated property. B'shogeg, he did that by mistake. V'chayovin oleh asham vada, in such a situation by Me'ilah, the person has to bring what's called an asham vada, a certain Karban asham. And so the Braisa continues and says, L'chayev al safek me'ilos asham talui. This pasuk teaches us that by a case of safek me'ilah, the person is obligated to bring an asham talui. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. In other words, according to Rabbi Akiva, since the parsha right before, earlier, talks about me'ilah, and then you have the vav that connects. So again, we're able to learn elyon mitachton, and it means to say that by a safek me'ilah, there would be an asham talui. V'chachamim potrin, but the chachamim say no, by a safek me'ilah, he is exempt, there is no asham Asham Talui in that situation. And so the Gemara says, my lav is it not? B'hakam iflagi, they're arguing exactly about this issue. Mar Savar Lameidin, one says we can learn Elyon Mitachton, or Mar Savar Ein Lameidin, and one says we cannot learn Elyon Mitachton. And so again, the Gemara is asking, according to the one who says you cannot learn Elyon Mitachton, so how are you going to know by Ben Bakar that there's a requirement by an Ola, that's a Ben Bakar, to slaughter that animal in the north of the Azara? And Rashi explains, al Safek Me'ilos, on a case of Safek Me'ila, that would be as follows, Hektish v'chulin lefanav. Let's say a person has Hektish and Chulin in front of him. V'nehene me'echon mehem, and then he gets benefit from one of them. Kisavor shneim Chulin, he thinks that they're both Chulin. V'achshav eino yodea, but now he doesn't know me'eza mehenene, from which one he got benefit. Mevi asham tali, so then he brings an asham taloi, lahagein min ha'yisurin, that protects him from afflictions. Ad she'yivada lo shavadei mol, until it does become known to him that he certainly did commit me'ila, and then at that point, umevi asham vadai, then at that point he would bring an asham vadai, a certain asham, v'gam hu ayil b'kesef shkolim, that also, he brings an ayil b'kesef shkolim, that's the value of the ayil, of the ram, that he brings as that carbon. And Rashi continues, Lameidin Elyon Mitachton. Again, according to Rabbi Akiva, we learn the earlier parsha from the later parsha, meaning Parshas Hektish mi Parshas Asham Tali. We learn the parsha that deals with Me'ila from the parsha that deals with Asham Tali, Shetachteh, which follows it. Lameimer, it means to teach us, the Hanena min Hektish nami, Maisi Asham Tali al Sveiko, that also somebody who derives benefit from Hektish, he brings an Asham Tali because of the doubt. Again, that's according to Rabbi Akiva, but the Chachamim say that we do not learn Elyon Mitachton. And the Gemara continues, Amar of Papa, Rav Papa says, the Kuli Alma Lameidin, actually, according to everybody, we do learn Elyon Mitachton, and the reason why the Chachamim say Pater, V'hainu Taima D'Rabbanan, and the reason that the Chachamim say Pater, meaning again, in a situation of a Safek Me'ila, that you don't bring an Asham Tali, why do they say exempt? Because Nemar Kan Mitzvahs, it says over here, Mitzvahs V'nemar B'chatas Chelev Mitzvahs, and it says by Chatas Chelev, that's a regular carbon Chatas. We generally use the example of Chelev, somebody eating the forbidden fat, as the example of a regular carbon chatos. It says the word mitzvos over there. Malahalon davar shechayavan al zdono kares ve'al shegagaso chatos. Just like over there, we're talking about something which, if it's done on purpose, the punishment is kares. If it's done by mistake, then a carbon chatos is brought. So afkan, so too over here, meaning by asham taloi, it has to be specifically shechayavan al zdono kares ve'al shegagaso chatos. It has to specifically be an avera, where if you would do that avera on purpose, the punishment would be kares, and if you do that avera b'shogeg by mistake, then the carbon chatas is brought, and so therefore an asham tali would not be brought on a situation where if it was done for certain you would bring an asham vadai. That's not where asham tali applies. Asham tali, according to the Rabbanan, applies specifically by situations of carbon chatas. And again, taking a look at the full psukim, again, the pasuk by Asham Tali we already saw, but it says Mikol Mitzvos Hashem, it says the word mitzvos over there. And then when it comes to the pasuk by Karban Chatas, it also has the word mitzvos. Daver el b'nei Yisrael lemor, nefesh kisechata v'shkaga Mikol Mitzvos Hashem, asher lo se yasen aviyasa me'achas mehena. That's the Karban Chatas, the Chatas Chelev. It uses the word mitzvah, so we understand that Asham Tali is specifically by Averos, where the person brings a Karban Chatas if he knows for certain that he committed the Avera. And Rashi explains, Nemar mitzvahs bi Asham Taloi. It says the word mitzvahs by Asham Taloi. V'yosasa achas mikol mitzvahs v'chein b'chatos. It says the same word by carbon chatos. Ma chatos bo al shigagas zodon kares. Just like a chatos is brought in a situation where a person made a mistake, where if he would have done it on purpose, it's kares. K'di alfin and b'harios, as is learned out in Harios. Af Asham Taloi, so to Asham Taloi al safik davar shezodono kares v'shigagaso chatos. The Asham Taloi is brought on something where if there's a doubt, so if there would not have been a doubt, so then on purpose it would be kares, and by mistake it would be chata. So then in a situation of doubt, an asham taloi is brought. And the Gemara continues for Rabbi Akiva. Now Rabbi Akiva, what does he do with this Gezerah Shaveh of mitzvos? Again, the connection between Asham Talui and a carbon chatos. He says it means as follows: Malahalon bekavua. Just like over there it's bekavua, it's a fixed carbon. Afkan bekavua. So too over here it is a fixed carbon, meaning Asham Talui applies anytime if the person committed the avera for certain, he would bring a fixed carbon. La'afuke chatos to tumas mikdash v'kadashav. That excludes the carbon chatos of tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Chashav, that Karban Chatas, let's say a person commits an Aveira involving Tumah in the Beis HaMikdash or involving Kodesh with Tumah, so then they don't bring a fixed Karban Chatas, the Olav Yoredu, that's a variable Karban Chatas. There, the type of Karban that is brought, the type of Karban Chatas that is brought, changes depending on the wealth of the individual, and so there is no Asham Taloi. That's what Rabbi Akiva learns from the Gzeira Shaveh of mitzvos. Rashi explains Rabbi Akiva, Gamar lo lahach Gzeira Shaveh hachi. Rabbi Akiva learns this Gzeira Shaveh as follows: Machatos Karban kavua lo ani ka'asher. Just like by a chatos, it's a fixed carbon. It doesn't matter if the person is poor or wealthy. Af Asham Taloi, so too the Asham Taloi, eino ba ella al safek chatos kavua. The Asham Taloi is only brought in a case of doubt, where again the chatos would be a chatos kavua. If there was no doubt, it would be a fixed chatos. Lafuke safek nichnas tamei lemikdash safek lo nichnas. To exclude, for example, let's say there's a doubt if a person who is tamei entered the mikdash or not. Hoel uvadai ba'olav yored. Since if he certainly entered the mikdash, he would bring a variable carbon chatos, what's called an olav yored. Ein mevi al sveiko asham taloi. So in a case of doubt, he does not bring the asham taloi. And the Gemara continues, v'rabbanan. The Rabbanan respond to this: Ein gezeira shava lemechsa. You can't make a gezeira shava halfway. Meaning, if you, Rabbi Akiva, are admitting that there is a gezeira shava of mitzvos, and that gezeira shava teaches us that asham taloi does not apply in situations of carbon olav yored, so then you should also agree that Gzeira Shaveh teaches us that the Asham Taloi only applies by carbon chatas and not by situations of carbon asham like by me'ilah. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Akiva nami. Now Rabbi Akiva also, Ein Gzeira Shaveh lemechsa, shouldn't he agree that you can't make a Gzeira Shaveh halfway? And the Gemara says, in hachinami, yes, indeed that is true. Everybody agrees you can't make a Gzeira Shaveh halfway. However, v'hacha b'haka miflagi. But here they're arguing as follows. Rabbi Akiva holds v'im nefesh, again going back to that pasuk, v'im nefesh with the vav, ksiv vav, since the vav is written over there, that conjunction that connects it to what's earlier. So mosif al inyan rishon, it's adding on what we talked about before, meaning again the earlier parsha is talking about a situation of me'ilah, of asham vadai, and therefore that says just for this specific issue, when it comes to me'ilah, there is going to be an asham taloi in a situation of doubt, even though really it should have been ein gezeira shaveh lemechsa, and we should have excluded me'ilah from asham taloi, but the vav tells us not to exclude it. The Rabbanan nami, but the Gemara says, okay, the Rabbanan also haksiv vim nefesh. They should also agree that it's written vim nefesh, and we should say that the vav is mosif al inyan rishon. And the Gemara continues and suggests, lema b'ha kamiflagi, should we say that they're arguing as follows? Demar savar hekesh adif, that one says the comparison is more important, meaning, according to Rabbi Akiva, that vav which is creating a comparison between asham taloi and the case of me'ilah, that takes precedence, and therefore we say that there is asham taloi by the case of me'ilah, even though that would go against the Gzeira Shaveh. Umar Savar, and then the other one, meaning the Rabbanan, they hold that Gzeira Shaveh Adif, that the Gzeira Shaveh is more important, and therefore we have to apply the Gzeira Shaveh across the board, and Asham Taloi is only going to apply by situations of Karban Chatas. And the Gemara continues, Lo no, Dekuli Alma de Hekesh Adif. Really, everybody agrees in theory that the Hekesh would take precedence, and really the Rabbanan should have learned from the Vav that Asham Taloi applies to cases of Me'ilah, but the reason why the Rabbanan do not say that is because V'yamri Loch Rabbanan, the Rabbanan will say to you that in this case we can apply the Vav in a different fashion. Tachton hu, the Gomer Me'elyon, the lower Parsha is learned from the upper Parsha, meaning the earlier Parsha of Me'ilah actually teaches us something about the later Parsha of Asham Taloi. That's what the Vav is doing. And what is it teaching us? It's teaching us li asham b'kesef shkalim. It's teaching us that an asham taloi has to be worth 2 silver shekel, just like the asham vada that's brought in the case of me'ilah. Shelo tomar, because you shouldn't say that lo yehi sveiko chamer mivado. Maybe someone would argue that a case of doubt, it shouldn't be stricter than a case of certainty, meaning in a case of certainty, if a person certainly committed the avera, they bring a carbon chatas, and that is not worth 2 shkalim, that's worth less. And so maybe somebody would say that the asham taloi also doesn't need to be worth 2 silver shekel. Somebody might argue, mavado chatas bas dinka, just like by a case of certainty, you bring a chatas that's just worth bas dinka. Dinka means to say a sixth of a dinar. It's worth much less. So av sveiko, so too when it comes to a case of doubt, asham bar dinka, maybe you would say that the asham talei just has to be worth a dinka, again, just 1/6 of a dinar. And so the Rabbanan say that's what the Vav is teaching, that when it comes to asham Asham Taloi, it has to be worth 2 silver shekel, just like the Asham Vadai. And the Gemara continues for Rabbi Akiva. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, Hasvar Minole, if he's not using the Vav in this fashion, so how does he learn this idea that by an Asham Taloi it has to be worth Kesef Shkolim? And the Gemara says to that, Nafkalei, Rabbi Akiva learns that out from the following. It says in the Pasuk, Mizos Toras HaAsham, he learns it out from the Pasuk which says, Zos Toras HaAsham, Torah Achas L'chol HaAshamos. That teaches that it's one law for all carbon Ashams. Just like an Asham Vadai, it's worth Kesef Shkolim, so to an Asham Taloi is worth Kesef Shkolim. The Gemara says, Teinach man di islay Toras. Now that works if one holds of this limud of Toras, learning from the word Toras. Man di leslay Toras mehecha gamar. But the one who doesn't hold of Toras, where does he learn it from? And the Gemara continues and says to that, Gamar be'erkacha be'erkacha, according to the one who doesn't learn the word Toras, so he can learn a Gzer Shavav be'erkacha be'erkacha. It says be'erkacha by Asham Taloi, it says be'erkacha by Asham Gezelos. So we would understand that all of them have to be worth Kesef Shkolim. The Gemara says to that, Teinach that works by the ashams where it says be'erkacha. But for example, asham shivcha charufa, there's an asham that's brought by a case of shivcha charufa, to lo ksibbe be'erkacha, there it doesn't say be'erkacha. So where do we learn that kind of asham is kesef shkolim? Ma'ikol amemer, what are we going to say about that? And the Gemara says to that, Gomer be'el, we can learn it from where it says el, ayil, it's talking about a ram. It says that over by shivcha charufa, and it says that as well by the case of me'ila, and therefore we learn through that Gezer Shava that by shivcha charufa, again, it's going to be an asham bekesef shkolim. And Rashi explains, ein gezer shava lemechsa, we don't make a gezer shava halfway. V'chihechi degamrinan law legabe hamilsa, just like Rabbi Akiva uses the gezer shava to teach that there is no asham talei by a case of an olav yored. So gomer mine nami. So also the Rabbanan are going to say you have to learn the eino ba ela al safek kares, that the carbon asham talei is only going to be brought in a situation of a safek kares. It is not going to be brought in a situation of a safek, where if it would have been certain, you would bring an asham vadai. V'amri lach Rabbanan, and then the Gemara said that the Rabbanan will say to you, meaning to say that the Rabbanan really, they do hold that the Hekesh should take precedence just like Rabbi Akiva. However, they're going to use that Vav in a different manner. Hekesh l'hachiyah, so they use the Hekesh as follows. Tachton hu degamar me'elyon will learn the lower parsha from the upper parsha. Liknos asham b'shtei sloim, meaning to say that the asham, it has to be worth shtei sloim, it has to be worth 2 silver shekel. Degabe asham mi'ilos ksiv be'erkacha kesef shkolim. By asham mi'ila, it does say be'erkacha kesef shkolim, it has to be 2 shkolim. The gamar asham tali minei, and we'll learn asham tali from there. Shelo tomar lo yesveiko shel kares chamer mivado. You shouldn't say that a case of safek kares is going to be stricter than a case of certainty, meaning by the carbon chatos, which is dinka, which is worth a dinka. Shasus, that means 1/6. Kilomar moa kesef, it is a moa kesef, shehu shasus shel dinar. It actually is a 1/6 of a dinar, as we said. V'lav dafka naka, when we say over here a 1/6 of a dinar, it doesn't specifically have to be a 1/6 of a dinar. Eladamim kalim bialma shalonitan lakitzva, it just means a small amount of money, there is no set amount. And then the Gemara said, Teinach man de islay Toras. Then the Gemara said that Rabbi Akiva, he could learn it from Toras or Asham, that all Ashams have to have the same value, but that only works according to the one who says you can learn Toras. B'shmaita kamaisa de Menachos, and that's discussed in the first sugya, in the early sugya of Menachos. And so then the Gemara said, if you don't learn Toras, you have a series of Gezer Shavas, where you can learn out by carbon Ashams, by all the Ashams, that it's going to be 2 shkolim. Be'erkacha, be'erkacha, you have a Gezer Shava of be'erkacha. Be'asham talayu v'asham gezelos, by Asham talayu and Asham Gezelos, Ksiv Bi'erkacha Li'asham, it says Bi'erkacha, V'gamrina Me'erkacha Di'asham Me'ilos, and we learn from Erkacha of Asham Me'ilos to Ksiv Be'erkacha Kesef Shkolim, where it says Be'erkacha Kesef Shkolim. So through those Gezeira Shavas, we can learn this idea of 2 Shkolim. And Rashi continues, when it comes to Shivcha Charufa, Gamar Be'el, we learn it from a Gezeira Shav of El, Ksiv Be'el Ha'asham, we'll take a look at the Shinui Nuschos, it's Ksiv Be'shivcha Charufa, it says by Shivcha Charufa, Be'el Ha'asham, it says Be'el Ha'asham. Uva Asham Milos Nami Ksiv, and by Asham Milos also, it's written over there as well, it says Be'el Ha'asham, and so therefore again you can make that Gezeira Shaveh, since it says Be'el Ha'asham by both. And Rashi continues and notes, V'asham Nazir V'asham Mitzora, and the Shinui Neschos takes out the word Nami, so it should read V'asham Nazir V'asham Mitzora Lomar Vinan. When it comes to Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora, that we don't need to include. Misham Dechsiv, because it's written, Misham Dechsiv Behu, says the Shinui Neschos, because it's written by them, Keves Ben Shana. It says that the carbon by Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora is a year-old Keves. Umida Ayel Shu Ben Shtei Shanim, and from the fact that an Ayel, which is a ram that's 2 years old, ba b'shtei slaim, that is 2 shekel. So keves ben shana ba b'sela, we can understand that a keves ben shana, that's going to be one shekel, and kula shmaitin b'krisus. All of this is learned in Meseches krisus. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots, chatos minolon deboit safon. From where do we know a carbon chatos? It needs to be in the north of the Azara, that it's slaughtered in the north of the Azara. The Gemara says dechsiv, because it's written in the pasuk v'shachat es hachatos b'makom ha'ola, that the chatos is slaughtered in the place of the ola. So that's how you know again that it's slaughtered in the north of the Azara. Rashi explains that chatos yiseruhu, that's an extra part of the pasuk, da b'chatos kai, because we're talking about carbon chatos. That's the whole context of the pasuk. V'havalei lemichda v'shachat osa. It should have just said you slaughter it. Lamali es hachatos. Why does it say es hachatos? Binyan av l'chol sheshmo chatos. It teaches us that anything that's called a chatos, shato, and safon, it requires north. Delotema dafka siras yochid dechsiv gabe. Don't say that it's only true by the seira of an individual where it's written over there. It's going to be by all carbon chatos. And the Gemara continues and asks eshkechon shechita. So we find by the slaughtering that's done in the north of the Azara. Kabbalah menolan. From where do we know the receiving of the blood is in the north of the Azara? The Gemara says because it's written v'lokach hakohen midam hachatos. Rashi explains v'lokach hakohen basar v'shachar ksiv b'chatos yochid. After the slaughtering, it says by the chatos of an individual. Umashma, and the understanding of the pasuk is b'makom ha'ola nami yilkach, that this yilkach, this taking, should be done in the same place as the ola. V'hach lakicha kabal, and the word lakicha over here refers to the receiving of the blood. To gomer b'gzer shava b'toras kohanim nemer kan lakicha v'nemer lahalon lakicha v'yikach Moshe chatzi hadam v'yosan ba'agonos. He uses the word of vayikach over there by Moshe also by the receiving of the blood and placing them in the basins. So we know that's talking about the kabbalas hadam, the receiving of the blood. The Gemara continues and asks mekabel atzmo minolan. From where do we know the mekabel? Rashi explains mekabel atzmo means the person receiving the blood. Shetzarech lamod b'tzafon. How do we know that he needs to stand in the north? V'lo yamod b'daram, that he should not stand in the south of the Azara. V'yoshit yado b'tzafon, and then stick his hand to the north. Samach lo nearby him etzel emtso hazara, by the middle of the Azara. Shahadarim v'atzafon nechlik usham, because in the middle of the Azara, that's where the division is between south and north. V'kibel minolan dehamar lekamonim amad b'daram v'kibel b'tzafon pasel. So how do we know again that he has to stand in the north? Because we're going to say later on that if he stands in the south and receives in the north, that is disqualified. So that's what the Gemara means by mekabel. How do we know that? And the Gemara says to that, Amar Kratz, because the pasuk says v'lokach, and we understand that to mean lo yikach, he should take himself. Rashi explains v'lokach lo yikach serseyu lemafreya. You have to turn the pasuk around. V'darsheyu es atzmo yikach, and darshan it as he takes himself lamakam hadam, to the place of the blood. And the Gemara continues eshkechon lemitzvah. Now we find that this is a mitzvah lechatchila to do it in this manner. But la'akev minayin, how do we know that it's absolutely required? And the Gemara says to that, kra achrina ksiv. That's because there's another pasuk that's written v'shachat oso b'makom asher yishchad es ha'ola. It says that he slaughters it in the place of the ola. V'tanyan, we learned in a brisa, heichon ola nishchata b'tzafon. Where is the ola slaughtered? It's in the north. Af zeh b'tzafon. So too, this is in the north. Rashi explains, Krachrina ksiv the darish leitana leikuva kedetanya. The Tana darshans this other pasuk as a requirement. V'shachar oso, it says v'shachar oso. B'seir nasi ksiv, this pasuk is written by the he-goat of the nasi. Af zeh b'tzafon, so too this is in the north. Hai kra migamar aleh, this pasuk teaches about it, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Memches Amid Beis.